People did this with such joy, and it was dangerous. Nobody cared but me. One guy flies out of the boat. It's a lot of fun! We drag him back in, and he's hit his head. He's still happy. Just see that, huh? Yeah. You got a little blood here. Oh, yeah. Jeez, that was fun, though, huh? Yeah. Don't let me fall asleep, all right? I'm going to have a zone bar. I'm fine. Geez, that was fun. Isn't it good to have fun? I'm at the front of the boat going, can we bang against the rocks one more time? I still have cartilage left in my right knee. And are we going to swing back around because I left one of my balls on the rock over there? Oh, an eagle has it. Forget about it. They see a ball, they swoop right in. My family likes to take me on little adventures. They took me to Hershey Park. It's an amusement park. There's nay-nay rides at the amusement park. There was a loop coaster. Nay-nay. I don't loop. I've done the math. I half loop and gravity says nay-nay. There's a safety bar. Nay-nay. There's a safety bar because it ain't safe. It's really a hold on to this or you're gonna die bar. In Hershey, Pennsylvania, they're running around on the rides. They found me in the gift shop. I thought I was in Willy Wonka's factory. Come with me and you'll see a world of sheer imagination. You eat a half a case of Reese's, you won't sing Oompa Loompas.
Good morning. It's Tuesday, Ayn Rand Tuesday, July the 11th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, the rape of the mind, government has no rights, Sean-Hannity, Larry-Kudlow, Senator Ron Johnson, Simon Ateba, Representative Young Kim, Larry Elder, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Part 3 of Chapter 7 of Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing and remove your hats for the national anthem of the United States of America.
Thank you. And now, there's no free lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
Today, most of the debate on the cutting edge in macroeconomics would not call itself Keynesian or monetarist or any other label relating to a school of thought. The data are considered the ruling principle, and it is considered suspect to have too strong a loyalty to any particular model about the underlying structure of the economy. Tyler Cowen. Cowen may be saying this prescriptively as if it were a good thing, or he may be saying it descriptively, merely observing what has become the case in modern economic debate. But what it is must surely be called an abject disaster, where the arrogance of data dependency pretends to work from no ideological framework, no belief system, no intellectual commitments or assertions. Post-Enlightenment economics have seen numerous errors in thought, but those errors have largely had a label attached to them, making identification and avoidance all the easier. There is no more dangerous error in economics than one hiding behind the disingenuity of anonymous love of data.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. What are the true conservative cultural priorities? Bring back hierarchy. Bring back the admiration of intelligence, morality, and beauty. Bring back single-income households, integration, parenting, the primacy of existence, certainty of knowledge, and universal rights and wrongs. Bring back principled behavior, masculinity and femininity. Bring back Adam 12, John F. Kennedy, the gold standard, pre-HMO medical care, and nonprofit news. Bring back civil service, the term stupid question, arguments and fights, the cultural influence of the church and the Boy Scouts. Bring back the influence of social organizations such as the Lions Club and the Rotary Club. Bring back bowling. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Sean Hannity.
This is interesting, isn't it? When you have people like Maureen Dowd and many other reliable Democrats and left-wing journalists turning on Biden, and those that support him are getting excoriated by their own party. Right now, as the presidential election is heating up, do you find the timing odd? The answer is written on the wall. They want both Joe and Kamala out of office, mark my words, and are now working to replace them at the top of the ticket behind the scenes before it's too late. Don't forget, both Joe and Kamala have historically bad poll numbers. The economy's a shambles. World affairs are an absolute unmitigated mess. Most Americans don't even believe Biden is capable of serving a second term. This is
And that was Sean Hannity about whether or not President Biden will be reelected or serve a second term. Back in a minute. Thank you. So I heard on the news today that there was another person that had been wrongfully convicted of murder and had been sitting in prison for a long period of time. And he was convicted apparently in large part on the basis of a jailhouse informant. And it was, according to what I heard on the radio, an informant that had been deemed unreliable by the court in 1996, but that the prosecution was still using this informant in the 2000s. And so but anyways, he was exonerated, and now he is being released, and the county is talking about trying to get an approval for a $3 million settlement for him. This is what happens when the government thinks that it has rights. This is what I'm talking about. The government has no right to an investigation. It has no right to an arrest. It has no right to an indictment. It has no right to a prosecution. It has no right to a conviction. And it has no right to incarceration. Okay? When the government thinks it has rights, very, very bad things happen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the rape of the mind.
Isolation and other factors in conditioning. Pavlov made another significant discovery. The conditioned reflex could be developed most easily in a quiet laboratory with a minimum of disturbing stimuli. Every trainer of animals knows this from his own experience. Isolation and the patient repetition of stimuli are required to tame wild animals. Pavlov formulated his findings into a general rule in which the speed of learning is positively correlated with the quiet and isolation. The totalitarians have followed this rule. They know that they can condition their political victims most quickly if they are kept in isolation. In the totalitarian technique of thought control, the same isolation applied to the individual is applied also to groups of people. This is the reason the civilian populations of the totalitarian countries are not permitted to travel freely and are kept away from mental and political contamination. It is the reason, too, for the solitary confinement cell and the prison camp. Another of Pavlov's findings was that some animals learn more quickly if they were rewarded by affection, by food, by stroking, each time they showed the right response, while others learned more quickly when the penalty for not learning was a painful stimulus. In human terms, the latter animals could be described as learning in order to avoid punishment. These different reactions in animals may perhaps be related to an earlier conditioning by the parents, and they find their counterparts among human beings. In some people, the strategy of reward and flattery is a stimulus to learning, while pain evokes all their resistance and rebellion. In others, retribution and punishment for failure can be a means of training them into the desired pattern. Before he can do his job effectively, the brainwasher has to find out to which category his victim belongs. There are people more amenable to brainwashing than others. Part of the response may be innate or related to earlier conditioning to conformity. Pavlov also distinguished between the weaker type of involuntary learning, in which the learned response was lost as soon as some disturbance occurred, and the stronger type, in which the training was retained through all kinds of changed conditions. As a matter of fact, Pavlov described more types of learning than this, but for our purposes, it is the only important to know that there are some types of people who lose their conditioned learning easily, while others, the so-called stronger types, retain it. This, by the way, is another example of how our choice of words reflects our bias. The descriptions strong and weak depend completely on the aim of the experimenter. But the totalitarian, the weak POWs, is the man who stubbornly refuses to accept the new conditioning. His weakness may be, in fact, a resistance, the result of a previous strong conditioning to loyalty to anti-totalitarian principles. We never know how strongly conditioning and initial learning are impressed on the personality. Rigid dogmatic behavior has its roots in early conditioning, and so may submissiveness based on ignorance rather than knowledge. Pavlov showed, too, how internal and external factors interact in the conditioning process. If, for example, a new laboratory assistant was brought in to work with the animals, all of their newly acquired patterns could easily be inhibited because of the animal's emotional reactions to the newcomer. Pavlov explained this as a disruptive reaction caused by the animal's investigatory reflexes, which led them to sniff around the stranger. Current psychology tends to interpret it as a result of the changed emotional rapport between the animal and its trainers. We can easily expand the implications of this more modern view into the field of human relations. It points up the fact that there are some persons who can create such immediate rapport with others that the latter will soon give up many old habits and ways of life to conform with new demands. There are inquisitors and investigators whose personalities so deeply affect their victims that the victims speedily yield their secrets and accept entirely new ways of thinking. We can see the same thing in psychotherapy, where the development of an emotional rapport between a doctor and patient is the most important factor leading to a cure. In some cases, rapport can be established immediately. In others, rapport cannot be built up at all. In most cases, it develops gradually during the course of the therapy. It is not difficult for a psychologist to test a man's softness and willingness to be conditioned, and as a matter of fact, the Pavlovians have developed simple questionnaires through which they can easily determine a given individual's instability and adaptability to suggestion and brainwashing. Pavlov found that all conditioning, no matter how strong it had been, became inhibited through boredom or through the repetition of too weak signals. The bell could no longer arouse salivation in experimental dogs if it was repeated too often or its tone was too soft. A process of unlearning took place. The result of such internal inhibition of conditioning and the loss of conditioned reflex action is sleep. The inhibition spreads over the entire activity of the brain cortex. The organism falls into a hypnotic state. This explanation of the process of inhibition was one of the first acceptable theories of sleep. An interesting psychological question is whether too much official conditioning causes boredom and inhibition, and whether that is the reason why the Stakhanovite movement in Russia was necessary to counteract the loss of productivity of people. We can make a comparison with what happened to our prisoners of war in Korea. Under the daily signal of dueling routine questions, for every word can act as a Pavlovian signal, their minds went into a state of inhibition and diminished alertness. This made it possible for them to give up temporarily their former democratic conditioning and training. When they had unlearned and suppressed the democratic way, their inquisitors could start teaching them the totalitarian philosophy. First, the old patterns have to be broken down in order to build up new conditioned reflexes. We can imagine that boredom and repetition arouse the need to give in and to yield to the provoking words of the enemy. Later, I shall come back to the system of negative stimuli used in conditioning for brainwashing. Mass conditioning through speech. According to official Pavlovian psychology, human speech is also a conditioned reflex activity. Pavlov distinguished between stimuli of the first order, which condition men and animals directly, and stimuli of the second order, with weaker and more complicated conditioning qualities. In this so-called second signal system, verbal cues replaced the original physical sound stimuli. Pavlov himself did not give much attention to this second signal system. It was especially after Stalin's publication in 1950 on the significance of linguistics for mass indoctrination, as quoted by Dobrogev, that the Russian psychologists began to do work in this area. In his letter, Stalin followed Engels' theory that language is the characteristic human bit of adaptive equipment. That tone and sound in speech have a conditioning quality is something we can verify from our own experience in listening to or in giving commands, or in dealing with our pets. Even the symbolic and semantic meaning of words can acquire a conditioning quality. The word traitor, for example, provokes direct feelings and reactions in the minds of those who hear it spoken, even if this discriminatory label is being applied dishonestly. Through an elaborate study on speech reflexes written by one of the leading Russian psychologists, Dobrogev, we get a fairly good insight into the ways in which speech patterns and word signals are used in the service of mass conditioning, by means of propaganda and indoctrination. The basic problems for the man-tamer are rather simple. Can man resist a government bent on conditioning him? What can the individual do to protect his mental integrity against the power of a forceful collectivity? Is it possible to do away with every vestige of inner resistance? Pavlov had already explained that man's relation to the external world and to his fellow men is dominated by secondary stimuli, the speech symbols. Man learns to think in words and in the speech figures given him, and these gradually condition his entire outlook on life and on the world. As Dobrogev says, the language is a means of man's adaptation to his environment. We could rephrase this statement in this way. Man's need for communication with his fellow men interferes with his relation to the outside world, because language and speech itself, the verbal tools we use, are variable and not objective. Dobrogev continues, speech manifestations represent conditioned reflex functions of the human brain. In a simpler way, we may say he who dictates and formulates the words and phrases we use, he who is master of the press and radio is master of the mind. In the Pavlovian strategy, terrorizing force can be finally replicated by a new organization of the means of communication. Ready-made opinions can be distributed day by day through press, radio, and so on, again and again till they reach the nerve cell and implant a fixed pattern of thought in the brain. Consequently,
Thank you. And now, a little bit of Kudlow.
David Weiss, this is according to our Davis Fund. You sent David Weiss a letter asking them to explain what, whether it's an open or closed investigation, or what else did you put in that letter, Mr. Grassley?
Well, we're trying to get information of the exact role of this Assistant U.S. Attorney Wolf in this 1023 document and the follow-up of that, because we know that she was involved in cutting short some of the investigations done by the IRS, and we want to know what sort of a role she played in whether or not the accusations of these telephone calls that you've already referred to was followed up properly. And we need to know this because we want to make sure that there's not two systems of justice, one for Republicans and one for Democrats.
This, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Senator Grassley Wolf, she's working for Merrick Garland, too, right? Just like Weiss. So she could be, on the politicalization or the weaponization charges?
Well, we know what the whistleblower from the IRS investigation said, that he wanted to investigate certain things at a home in Virginia, other things, and they said you can't do that. They said also that you couldn't ask questions about the so-called big guy, and everybody knows what that's a reference to. And so just exactly what role does she play if she stopped investigations of some of the things that the investigators at IRS wanted to follow up on? What was followed up on the 1023 in regard to the FBI investigating whether these phone calls actually took place? We've got to know what the FBI doing. Is it following up the way they should follow up, or are they sweeping things under the rug to protect somebody?
Senator, I want to get to the Burisma story in a second, sir, but I just want to ask you this. You talk about the FBI follow-up. I still can't figure, and I'd like to know. Now, Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, I believe is going to appear before Jim Jordan's Judiciary Committee, I think, sir, on Wednesday. But look at the FBI, from all accounts, Senator Grassley, has stopped, obstructive, slow walk, done everything they can to deny or prevent these 1023s from going public. Don't you find that remarkable? And don't you find that objectionable?
Even more remarkable is the fact that I've made public that Representative Comer and I have read an unredacted document of the 1023 that we're talking about. And then, in order to satisfy the House, they thought they could get away with bringing that document up to the SCIF for members of the House Oversight Committee to read. And then guess what? The line talking about the 17 recorded phone calls was redacted. It wasn't redacted in the document that I and Comer read. And so I hope Wednesday somebody in the House committee will ask Ray why that was redacted for the House to see, when I know what those lines said. 17 phone calls supposedly recorded by somebody in Ukraine, 2 of them with then Vice President Biden, and 15 of them with Hunter Biden.
So you have seen that from the 1023. The FBI says it doesn't exist, or they just redacted it. The reason is, look at. I don't think there's anybody alive who doubts your word. No one messes with Senator Grassley, including me as a small fry. But the fact is, you believe, you're saying you saw references of these 17 phone calls, 2 to Joe Biden, 15 to Hunter, that was in an FBI 1023. You saw them, and you're sticking with that story.
Well, not only that, but Congressman Comer saw the same one. We saw it from a whistleblower who we must protect these whistleblowers, and the document is not in my possession, but I had an opportunity to read it as slow as I wanted to thoroughly understand it, and these lines about the 1020 in the 1023, referring to the telephone recordings, were not redacted in the document I read. Why was it redacted when the House of Representatives Oversight Committee had an opportunity to read it in the skiff?
All right. Well, somebody's going to have to account for that. Senator Grassi, where are these tapes, these audio tapes? What's happened to them? What's the guy's... You know, this is a Burisma oligarch. Nobody can find him. He's on the lam with his tapes. He may be at the gambling casino in Montenegro. No one knows where this guy is. How are we going to find him? This is probably the most important political event in this story, and maybe one of the worst corruption scandal in the history of the United States.
Well, only the FBI can answer that, and I don't have an answer from the FBI. Did they follow up, or did they show their usual political bias and shove it under the rug?
Well, what do you think? What do you think? You think the FBI has the tapes? Do you think there's only one set of tapes? You're a pretty smart fella, and as I said, no one's going to mess with you when you get your backup. What's happened to these tapes?
I want the FBI to tell me, because that's the only place I can get the information, because they have the responsibility to investigate. Remember, 1023 is an unclassified document. Larry, you should be able to read it as much as I can.
Yes, sir.
And it has these statements in it. And how is the FBI following up?
And that was Larry Kudlow interviewing Senator Chuck Grassley about some tapes that allegedly incriminate President Joe Biden in a bribery scheme. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now Senator Ron Johnson on Fox News.
When he heard that Joe Biden was going to be running for president, that alarmed him because he knew how compromised Joe Biden would be. So he met with 2 prosecutors from the Southern District of New York and 4 FBI agents in Brussels for 2 days in March of 2019. What's interesting about those individuals, one of the prosecutors from the Southern District of New York is the same prosecutor that prosecuted Patrick Ho, the money launderer that paid Hunter Biden $1 million to defend him. And in that trial, he prevented the name of Biden's from being brought into court. Also, one of the FBI agents was the same agent then that signed the subpoena from the Hunter Biden laptop. So, you know, what Dr. Luft has shown is the same financial transactions, the millions of dollars, the $100,000 per month retainer for Hunter, $65,000 for James Biden, paid by CEFC. He's got a wealth of information, but they never followed up on that meeting. Instead, they arrested him in Cyprus to silence him. They could have gone to Israel. He resides in Israel. We have extradition treaties, but they instead arrest him in Cyprus. Now, he's literally fleeing for his life right now. He's on the run. He's an important witness. He needs to be granted immunity to be able to testify and tell his story.
And that was Senator Ron Johnson demanding that anti-Biden whistleblower Gal Luft be granted immunity to testify against President Biden. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now from the Twitter account of Simon Ateba. Exhausted Georgia Democrat Representative Maisha Maynor makes a stunning defection to the GOP, citing feeling crucified and abandoned by the Democrats. Maynor represents District 56 in Georgia. She wrote, "My name is Rep. Maisha Maynor, and today I made the decision to leave the Democrat Party. I represent a blue district in the city of Atlanta, so this wasn't a political decision for me. It was a moral one. I will never apologize for being a black woman with a mind of my own." And that was, again, a tweet from the Twitter account of Simon Ateba. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Representative Young Kim from California.
You wrote a very compelling op-ed in The Hill. It says that the affirmative action ruling, a victory for protecting the American dream, quoting, race-based education policies counter the values we hold dear and divide us as a nation, undermine global competitiveness, and prevent students from reaching their full potential. Expand on that. I got about 30 seconds for it.
Telling a student...
It's a long article for 30 seconds, I know.
Right. I mean, I hope everybody reads my op-ed because, telling a student that race matters more than your merit is sending a wrong message. So the Supreme Court decision is a win for all Americans.
Right.
Look, I didn't get to where I am today because I'm an Asian or woman or from different ethnic background. I got here because I worked my butt off.
Right.
And I think we need to send the message that your hard work, your determination, your merit matters more than the race or ethnicity or any type of different background. And also because, especially in California, we stopped the affirmative action by passing the Prop 209. As a result, we see more increase in the students entering UC, CSUs, and even community colleges because they worked hard to get to where they are. To think that minority students cannot get into the colleges because of who you are, what your background, it's an insult to me.
You wrote a very...
And that was Representative Young Kim from California. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Larry Elder.
Well, my father was born 50 years after slavery ended, Athens, Georgia, Jim Crow South, and he was literally thrown out of the house by his illiterate mother. He never met his biological father, 13-year-old. My father joined the Marines, came out after the Marines, tried to get him a job as a cook. Nobody would hire him because of racism. He goes to California. Nobody would hire him because of racism. Works 2 full-time jobs cleaning toilets, goes to night school to get his GED, and then after that goes to trade school to learn how to operate a small restaurant, saves his nickels and dimes, starts a little restaurant in the area of LA called Pico Union, runs it until his mid-80s, owns that property, the property next door, plus the house we still have in our family. So when my dad retired, he was pretty much a millionaire. That's what you can do in America if you work hard. If there's a formula other than hard work and sacrifice, I don't know what that formula is. And what this panel ought to be talking about is the real disparity, which is the large percentage of black kids who enter the world, 70% without a father in the home, married to the mother. And the stats are clear. If you're raised without a dad, you're 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. The second big disparity is the crisis of urban education in America, where, just to choose 2 cities, Baltimore will, 13 public high schools where 0% of the kids can do math at grade level. Another half a dozen, only 1% can. That's half of all the public high schools in Baltimore, all located in the inner city. Either 0%, only 1% can do math at grade level. Chicago, 53 public schools, 0% of the kids can do math at grade level. And the Democrats oppose school choice, even though studies have shown they improve test scores, and more importantly, they improve dropout rates. So they ought to be talking about what we can do to empower us instead of whining and complaining that somebody else owes you something. I consider reparations, Will, to be the extraction of money from people who were never slave owners to be given to people who were never slaves.
And that was Larry Elder. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now Vivek Ramaswamy.
And I think that the right way to do this is actually ensure equality of opportunity, educational access at an early age, which, by the way, we don't have in this country, starting at an actual young age. How about doing that in a way that's agnostic to race? That way we prevent seeing one another on the basis of a color of our skin, but we actually solve the real inequalities that we have when it starts with inequality of opportunity, starting with education. So my view is, I think my approach is actually going to be more successful in lifting up more black Americans than have been the Lyndon Johnson approach of actually using race-based quota systems.
And that was Vivek Ramaswamy on BET's The Breakfast Club. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, part 3 of chapter 7 of Philosophy Who Needs It by Ayn Rand.
Of others, not a sacrificial animal serving anyone's need.
This is implicit in the function of capitalism, but until now, it has never been stated explicitly, in moral terms. Why not? Because this is the base of a morality diametrically opposed to the morality of altruism, which, to this day, people are afraid to challenge. There is a tragic, twisted sort of compliment to mankind involved in this issue. In spite of all their irrationalities, inconsistencies, hypocrisies, and evasions, the majority of men will not act in major issues without a sense of being morally right, and will not oppose the morality they have accepted. They will break it, they will cheat on it, but they will not oppose it. And when they break it, they take the blame on themselves. The power of morality is the greatest of all intellectual powers. And mankind's tragedy lies in the fact that the vicious moral code men have accepted destroys them by means of the best within them. So long as altruism was their moral ideal, men had to regard capitalism as immoral. Capitalism certainly does not and cannot work on the principle of selfless service and sacrifice. This was the reason why the majority of the 19th century intellectuals regarded capitalism as a vulgar, uninspiring, materialistic necessity of this earth, and continued to long for their unearthly moral ideal. From the start, while capitalism was creating the splendor of its achievements, creating in a silence, unacknowledged and undefended, morally undefended, the intellectuals were moving in greater and greater numbers towards a new dream, socialism. Just as a small illustration of how ineffectual a defense of capitalism was offered by its most famous advocates, let me mention that the British socialists, the Fabians, were predominantly students and admirers of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. The socialists had a certain kind of logic on their side. If the collective sacrifice of all to all is the moral ideal, then they wanted to establish this ideal in practice, here and on this earth. The arguments that socialism would not and could not work did not stop them. Neither has altruism ever worked, but this has not caused men to stop and question it. Only reason can ask such questions, and reason, they were told on all sides, has nothing to do with morality. Morality lies outside the realm of reason. No rational morality can ever be defined. The fallacies and contradictions in the economic theories of socialism were exposed and refuted time and time again, in the 19th century as well as today. This did not and does not stop anyone. It is not an issue of economics, but of morality. The intellectuals and the so-called idealists were determined to make socialism work. How? By that magic means of all irrationalists. Somehow. It was not the tycoons of big business. It was not the labor unions. It was not the working classes. It was the intellectuals who reversed the trend toward political freedom and revived the doctrines of the absolute state, of totalitarian government rule, of the government's right to control the lives of the citizens in any manner it pleases. This time, it was not in the name of the divine right of kings, but in the name of the divine right of the masses. The basic principle was the same: the right to enforce, at the point of a gun, the moral doctrines of whoever happens to seize control of the machinery of government. There are only two means by which men can deal with one another: guns or logic, force or persuasion. Those who know that they cannot win by means of logic have always resorted to guns. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the socialists got their dream. They got it in the 20th century, and they got it in triplicate, plus a great many lesser carbon copies. They got it in every possible form and variant, so that now there can be no mistake about its nature. Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, socialist England. This was the collapse of the modern intellectual's most cherished tradition. It was World War II that destroyed collectivism as a political ideal. Oh yes, people still mouth its slogans, by routine, by social conformity, and by default, but it is not a moral crusade any longer. It is an ugly, horrifying reality, and part of the modern intellectual's guilt is the knowledge that they have created it. They have seen for themselves the bloody slaughterhouse, which they had once greeted as a noble experiment, Soviet Russia. They have seen Nazi Germany, and they know that Nazi means National Socialism. Perhaps the worst blow to them, the greatest disillusionment, was Socialist England. Here was their literal dream, a bloodless socialism, where force was not used for murder, only for expropriation, where lives were not taken, only the products, the meaning, and the future of lives. Here was a country that had not been murdered, but had voted itself into suicide. Most of the modern intellectuals, even the more evasive ones, have now understood what socialism, or any form of political and economic collectivism, actually means. Today, their perfunctory advocacy of collectivism is as feeble, futile, and evasive as the alleged conservatives' defense of capitalism. The fire and the moral fervor have gone out of it. And when you hear the liberals mumble that Russia was not really socialistic, or that it was all Stalin's fault, or that socialism never had a real chance in England, or that what they advocate is something that's different somehow, you know that you are hearing the voices of men who haven't a leg to stand on. Men who are reduced to some vague hope that somehow my gang would have done it better. The secret dread of modern intellectuals, liberals and conservatives alike, the unadmitted terror at the root of their anxiety, which all of their current irrationalities are intended to stave off and to disguise, is the unstated knowledge that Soviet Russia is the full, actual, literal, consistent embodiment of the morality of altruism. That Stalin did not corrupt a noble ideal, that this is the only way altruism has to be or can ever be practiced. If service and self-sacrifice are a moral ideal, and if the selfishness of human nature prevents men from leaping into sacrificial furnaces, there is no reason that a mystic moralist could name why a dictator should not push them in at the point of bayonets. For their own good, for the good of humanity, or for the good of prosperity, or the good of the latest bureaucrat's latest 5-year plan. There is no reason that they can name to oppose any atrocity. The value of a man's life, his right to exist, his right to pursue his own happiness, these are concepts that belong to individualism and capitalism, to the antithesis of the altruist morality. 20 years ago, the conservatives were uncertain, evasive, morally disarmed before the aggressive moral self-righteousness of the liberals. Today, both are uncertain, evasive, morally disarmed before the aggressiveness of the communists. It is not a moral aggressiveness any longer. It is the plain aggressiveness of a thug. But what disarms the modern intellectuals is the secret realization that a thug is the inevitable, ultimate, and only product of their cherished morality. I have said that faith and force are corollaries, and that mysticism will always lead to the rule of brutality. The cause of it is contained in the very nature of mysticism. Reason is the only objective means of communication and of understanding among men. When men deal with one another by means of reason, reality is their objective standard and frame of reference. But when men claim to possess supernatural means of knowledge, no persuasion, communication, or understanding are possible. Why do we kill wild animals in the jungle? Because no other way of dealing with them is open to us. And that is the state to which mysticism reduces mankind. A state where, in case of disagreement, men have no recourse except to physical violence. And more, no man or mystical elite can hold a whole society subjugated to their arbitrary assertions, edicts, and whims without the use of force. Anyone who resorts to the formula, "It's so because I say so," will have to reach for a gun sooner or later. Communists, like all materialists, are neo-mystics. It does not matter whether one rejects the mind in favor of revelations or in favor of conditioned reflexes. The basic premise and the results are the same. Such is the nature of the evil which modern intellectuals have helped to let loose in the world, and such is the nature of their guilt. Now, take a look at the state of the world. The signs and symptoms of the Dark Ages are rising again all over the earth. Slave labor, executions without trial, torture chambers, concentration camps, mass slaughter. All the things which the capitalism of the 19th century had abolished in the civilized world are now brought back by the rule of the neo-mystics. Look at the state of our intellectual life. In philosophy, the climax of the Kantian version of reason has brought us to the point where alleged philosophers, forgetting the existence of dictionaries and grammar primers, run around studying such questions as, what do we mean to say when we say, "The cat is on the mat"? While other philosophers proclaim that nouns are an illusion, but such terms as if then, but, and or have profound philosophical significance. While still others toy with the idea of an index of prohibited words and desire to place on it such words as, I quote, entity, essence, mind, matter, reality, thing. In psychology, one school holds that man, by nature, is a helpless, guilt-ridden, instinct-driven automaton, while another school objects that this is not true, because there is no scientific evidence to prove that man is conscious. In literature, man is presented as a mindless cripple inhabiting garbage cans. In art, people announce that they do not paint objects, they paint emotions. In youth movements, if that's what it can be called, young men attract attention by openly announcing that they are beat. The spirit of it all, both the cause of it and the final climax, is contained in a quotation which I am going to read to you. I will preface it by saying that in Atlas Shrugged, I stated that the world is being destroyed by mysticism and altruism, which are anti-man, anti-mind, and anti-life.
And that was part 3 of Chapter 7 of Philosophy Who Needs It by Ayn Rand. Back in a minute. Thank you. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all of the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. And until next time, be honest, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.